My name's Richard Smith, and today we're going to look at my top 5 tanks. Again, because I've done one, but look, I'm the director of a tank museum. Surely I'm allowed to do another one. Let's look at my next top 5. Please remember to like, subscribe, or click the little notification bell if you don't want to miss out on these videos. And I'd just like to say thank you to all our patrons for making this possible. Please join them if you can. Now, for aficionados of the Tank Museum's YouTube channel, it may seem eerily familiar to see me here at the beginning of a top 5 tanks video, because I have done one before, but that was in the midst of the first lockdown in the Great Plague, and it was on my laptop in my study at home. So the team asked me to do another one, and I couldn't remember what I said in the first one. So I thought, rather than doing the same top 5 again, I'd come up with a different top 5. And the great thing when you're thinking about top 5 tanks is that you can almost pick any 5 you like, depending on the criteria you're using to pick them. And one of my favourite top 5, bottom 5 videos was Al Murray's combination, where he had the same tanks in his top 5 and his bottom 5, because those criteria are all important. Now, you can say, if we were just all picking our favourite tanks or our best ever tanks, all of us would end up with 5 First World War British tanks, because those are obviously the best ones. However, what I'm going to look at today is 5 different tanks with a different basis on which I'm going to choose them. And the basis I'm looking at today, the magic word is the word significance. Because what I want to look at is 5 tanks where we're not thinking about the type of tank that's involved. We're thinking about why this particular one here at the Tank Museum is special and what makes this tank important. So that's the basis that we're going to look today at my next top 5 tanks. Now, number 5 on my top 5 list today is Tiger 131. Now remember, what this video is about, my top 5 today, is not about types of tanks. So what I'm not thinking about today is Tiger a good tank? Do we like Tigers? All that kind of stuff. What I'm looking at today is why this Tiger is so important. And the special thing about this Tiger, Tiger 131, is that this is the most famous tank in the world. This is the tank that clocks a couple of million views a year on YouTube, that's been in the Fury movie as a Hollywood star, and as books and underpants, and I'm pretty sure we've got underpants. It's got this, everything around this tank makes it famous. And what I'm thinking about today is, why is this tank so famous? And yes, it's famous because it's a Tiger, but there are other Tigers in the world. There's 6 kind of original Tigers, a few Franken Tigers around. But the thing that makes this Tiger special is that this is the only running Tiger in the world, and it's in running it that this one becomes unique and why this one has become so famous. And when you're in a museum, running vehicles is not a trivial decision. Running vehicles is a big deal. This is very different from running your car at home. So when we're in a museum, we're thinking about originality and authenticity, and we're thinking about the integrity of an object. And that's quite different from running a car at home, because when you run stuff, you definitely break stuff. The only thing you can guarantee is you're going to break stuff. Now, when your car at home breaks, the process is fairly straightforward. You blame your wife for driving it the wrong way, you think about selling it, and then you give up and buy a new part and get it fixed anyway and just grumble about it, but you move on in life. If you're a museum and you break stuff, that's a big deal. So making these decisions is taxing and an intense part of what we do here. And the trade-off is that we have to accept the fact that we're going to do some damage to the vehicle, But in return for that, we get this huge step up in cultural value because it brings an object to life. We're not a museum here of statues. This is a museum of machines as our core objects in our collection. And for a machine, if it's just static inside a display hall, I always described it as this is like a stuffed lion in a natural history museum. How much of a lion can the kids understand if it's just there static inside a case? It's in running a vehicle that the vehicle comes to life and engages people on a completely different level, where you can smell the petrol, you can hear the sound, you can feel the ground shake as it moves, and it's that makes Tiger 131 such a special vehicle. And it's because of that, we know it makes a difference. If you look at things like YouTube, the other 5 Tigers have 200,000 or 300,000 viewings on YouTube between them. This gets a couple of million a year. And while using YouTube as a metric of cultural value is fraught with risk, if that was the only thing that mattered in terms of view counts, you'd have a lot more videos on the Tank Museum YouTube channel of cats that look a bit like Hitler. But it gives a flavour of what people care about and what people want to engage with. And it's by doing this, by working with the vehicle, managing that balance of cultural value compared to degradation, that Tiger 131 in our field in museums has become one of the most important case studies in the world of the cultural value and the process of making decisions about large working objects and how we use them. And because of that, because it's the most famous tank in the world, Tiger 131 is number 5 on my top 5 list. Now, number 4 on my top 5 list of tanks today is a Sherman tank called Michael. Now, there are 50,000-ish Sherman tanks made altogether, but of the 50,000, in my view, this one here is the most important of all of them. Now, if you want to find out about the tank itself, watch David Fletcher's video. He does it better than me, and he tells you everything you need to know about the vehicle. But what I'm thinking about today is the significance of this particular vehicle, and it's the meaning, how it fits into the world, what we learn about the world from this tank that we don't learn from other Shermans. And for me, there are 2 things that are really important about this one. The first one is, this is the oldest Sherman left in the world. It's Sherman number 2. No one really knows what happened to Sherman number 1. It disappeared somewhat into the ether in a puff of smoke. Sherman number 2, oldest tank in the world, in museums, in heritage. These superlatives are oldest, fastest, first, biggest, worst, best, all that kind of stuff. Superlatives matter. People give significance to the most extreme ones. So oldest counts. But I think actually the second reason that this tank is important is the most significant reason, and that's related to the name Michael. Now, normally to get your name on the side of a tank, you have to be a soldier, as they're the people who use them. But this chap, Michael, was a diplomat. He was a bloke called Michael Dewar, and he was head of the British tank mission to Washington in the Second World War. And it's his job to negotiate the deals with the Americans about getting new modern tanks for the British Army to use against the Germans. And when Michael Dewar goes to America in the summer of 1940, the tanks the British are using, or producing at least, are things like Covenanter, which is it's starting to get into its peak of production around there. And Covenanter, you get some apologists for Covenanter, but it's really a genuine shocker of a tank. You don't make over 1,000 of something you're only ever going to plan to use for training. And it's the background which Michael Dewar has negotiation for equipment like this. And because of Michael Dewar's work, his success of the negotiation, the American desire to help the British, this was the first Sherman that the British get from the Americans in the Second World War. It's the first of something like 15,000, roughly, that the British Army use in the Second World War. But this one in particular is paraded around the UK as a symbol of the Americans are on our side. And when we think about the meaning of an object, let's just dwell on this for a moment and think what that means. That this was a British at the lowest ebb. You know, things have gone a bit upside down on the continent, and things haven't gone as planned. And to be able to say the Americans are on our side makes a real difference. And yes, the Americans speak funny and they don't play cricket, but you'd rather have them on your side than not. And the endurance of what's arguably the world's most significant, most important, most successful military alliance, the English-speaking nations of the Second World War and beyond, is embodied in this particular vehicle. If you want an explanation about why did British soldiers serve in Afghanistan, well, it's because America was attacked and Britain was on the same side, and this is why Britain was on the same side. So as a symbol of that extraordinary alliance, Michael the Sherman is number 4 on my top 5 list. Number 3 on my top 5 list today is Tog 2. Well, I can't put in Tiger into this top 5 and not include Tog, really, can I? And is Tog 2 the best tank ever? You could probably debate that. But what we're looking at today is significance when we're looking at why this tank is particularly important. So I'm not thinking here about the type of tank that Tog is. I'm thinking about why this tank matters as an individual piece. In particular for me with Tog 2, what I want to think about is how it's significant, how its meaning has changed in the last 10 years or so. That's because Tog 2 is a tank that has always had significance as a piece. So this is a piece where it's a Second World War prototype. It's an attempt to put a great big gun on a British tank. It's a worthy but failed prototype, but it's a prototype that's made and designed by the original tank team. TOG stands for the old gang. These are the real tank experts from the First World War who come back and have another go. And it's always had that significance to it. But that was significance actually for a very small number of people. And when we rearranged the Tank Museum about 15 years ago, TOG was kind of an 80-ton sort of side story that took up huge amounts of space and was difficult to move. And it moved into this corner in some ways because of its lack of significance. And it's the only place we could put it, and we had to put soap down on the floor and all sorts of things to get it into this position. But then things changed, and what changed was not the vehicle itself, but how people related to it. And what changed in particular was wargaming. World of Tanks came along. And we've had a long-running partnership here with World of Tanks, and I often get asked about how we as a tank museum found ourselves partnering with a video game company, and what that means and what difference it makes to us. And for me, TOG 2 is the best example of good things that can come from different sorts of partnerships. That when I first met Victor Kisley when he came here in 2011, we went around the Tank Museum, we had a cup of tea, and we realised we shared similar views on many things in the world, particularly about the study of military history. And studying military history is something which, the more people understand the military history, the more the understanding there is in the world about warfare, the less attractive warfare becomes. That when people know what war means, it's very difficult to engage in it casually. And we realised that here at the Tank Museum we had the real thing. We got the actual stuff. And Victor with World of Tanks had a huge and growing audience, and we realised we were able to put these things together, we could potentially do something quite special. And TOG shows how that works, because when TOG II came into the World of Tanks game, the interest in this vehicle skyrocketed. And by people like the mighty Jingles and the other influencers highlighting this vehicle, it gained a level of interest that it simply didn't have before. And it's a wonderful example of how an object which always had intrinsic value can be brought to life for hundreds of thousands or millions of people by the way in which we engage with it, and by being a tank for which the engagement, taking it to new sorts of people who would never have heard of this before. This tank, TOG 2, earns its place on my top 5 list at number 3. The Tank Museum is a registered charity, and every purchase you make from our online shop directly supports our work. We ship worldwide, and if you subscribe to our email list, we'll give you 10% off your next order. When you finish this video, go to tankmuseumshop.org and you'll find something you never knew you needed. Now, the next tank on my top 5 list of tanks today is a Mark I British First World War tank. Now, I know what you're thinking. Now, people who saw my first top 5 tanks would say, hang on a second, you did a Mark I in your first one too. This is cheating. Well, it's not completely cheating, because that was a completely different Mark I tank to the one I'm going to talk about next. This one is different, this one's special, and we've actually got, if you think about it, depending on your interpretation of a tank, 3 Mark I tanks here at the Tank Museum. Now, it's fair to say that this particular Mark I is suffering from a certain amount of degradation. But here we have Mark I tank number D6. Now, yes, it's showing some signs of wear and tear. It's seen better days, but in the words of a great philosopher, it's really only a flesh wound. And I don't think we should be letting a few car park dings take away from the fact that this is one of the most important tanks in the world, because D6 is special. D6 was one of the first tanks ever to go into battle. And we know this because of the work of a great historian, a guy called Trevor Pidgeon, one of the best historians I've ever met. And Trevor described these bits as the holy relics of armoured warfare. And this was a guy who was qualified to have an opinion. Because when I say he's one of the best historians I've met, that's because historians are on a quest for truth and they want to find out what actually happened. History isn't guesswork. And Trevor Pidgeon did the pick and shovel work of research. He did the grindy, boring research, the really detailed stuff about the Battle of Fleur, the first time that tanks were used. And Trevor went tank by tank, blow by blow, through the Battle of Fleur to find out exactly what happened. So for each tank, he was using aerial photographs to tell not just where the commander of the tank thought it had gone, but where it had actually gone. And he did that for each vehicle. And it was during a tour of the battlefield that he was taking that he found these pieces on the battlefield. And Trevor was probably the only person in the world who could not only identify them as parts of a Mark I tank, but parts of a specific Mark I tank. He knew which one it was and what had happened to it. And Trevor was able to identify this as D6. Now, D6 was commanded by a young man called Reginald Legge. And Reginald Legge was one of the very first tank soldiers ever. He joined up very early on into the Heavy Branch Machine Gun Corps. He had a reputation as a bit of a martinet. And when the attack's launched in Fleur, Legg's tank is one of the ones that gets over the start line. There's only about a dozen or something of them get over the start line. He gets over the start line and actually really starts mixing it with the German position. He takes on an artillery battery, and a colonel of a nearby infantry regiment said he did work of material value, that he really made a difference. And bear in mind, as the first day of armoured warfare, what happens on that day is proving the concept of a tank. This is a day that, if it's just a messy disaster and nothing gets achieved, the tanks may not have continued to exist. They may have just dropped away. But Legg's contribution specifically makes a real difference. There isn't a happy ending for Legg himself. His tank gets knocked out. He and his crew escape. He gets hit. And he dies. We're not sure exactly when he dies. He either dies on that day, on the 15th September, or the day after. He's captured by the Germans. But Legg dies. And one of his colleagues, another young tank commander, a guy called Arthur Blowers, reflects back on the event later, and he says, "Dear old fire-eating Legg, he came so near to being great." But if you look at what we've got here at the Tank Museum, these are the first things we show our visitors as they come into the museum. These are the origins of armoured warfare, physically here. They connect us to this monumental, essential, this pivotal event in the story of armoured warfare. They connect us to a young man in battle, leading his crew into the fight, closing with the enemy at the most dangerous place in the world. He's right at the front of the Battle of the Somme. But it also says something for us about Reginald Legg as well, that by putting these here, and over the course of the time this particular display has been open here at the Tank Story exhibition at the Tank Museum, there's probably been the best part of a couple of million people have walked past this exhibit and have had the chance to learn about Reginald Legg's story. And perhaps what we've been able to do here is help Reginald Legg become more than just near to being great. And that's why this is number 2 on my top 5 list of tanks. Now, number 1 on today's top 5 list is a First World War British tank, which probably shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who saw my first top 5 I did before, because I really like First World War British tanks. But this is a completely different First World War British tank to any of the ones that are in my top 5 initially, and therefore this is absolutely fine. And this is the Tank Museum's Mark V tank. Now, Mark V tank is an unusual thing anyway. There's only 5 of them around. This is the only one in Western Europe. So as an object in itself, it has significance. So rare is important. It's also probably the best documented Mark V in the world. So we know this particular tank went into action on the 8th of August at the Battle of Amiens in 1918 and was commanded by a young man called Harold Wittenbury, who won a military cross in this tank, using it as a battering ram to demolish a German position, which it really didn't take due care of the integrity of the artefact, but he had a job to do, so we'll let him off. So it's an important artefact. It's an artefact with a distinctive story, and those both add significance, and significance is really the magic word for today's top 5. It's what makes this vehicle important. But the significance of this vehicle for me goes beyond that. And that's because this particular vehicle, this Mark V, this was the last working British First World War tank in the world. This was the last one. It was operated here for decades to help bring the First World War to life. But when I arrived here at the Tank Museum in 2006, we had to make a decision about whether we were going to run it for Tank Fest. And actually we decided that year in 2006 that we were going to stop running it. And we were going to stop running it because of cracks in the frame of the vehicle, which threatened its integrity. There are a number of cracks down here, which effectively really threaten the vehicle's structure. So what happens on a First World War tank? There isn't any suspension on these vehicles. So because there is no suspension, when this goes over an obstacle, what you get is the whole weight of the vehicle goes across the struts up and down and across the vehicle and the metal plates that hold it. So as long as those cracks are in compression, they're probably okay. But if they go into tension, if they open out, then the vehicle can tear apart. But it's beyond the fact that I'm part of this tank story. So I made the decision of we're not going to run this anymore. But the way I made that decision also matters to me. And that's because it wasn't a decision I could take lightly, and it wasn't a decision I felt I could take on my own. So I called in the cavalry. And in particular, I called in my dad. Now, this isn't quite as random a move as it might seem, because my dad's he's a bit of a metal basher. He's a metallurgist by trade, and specifically, actually, he used to run the Oxford University materials department, so he's quite good on things like metal fatigue and steel. So I went round this vehicle with my dad and also another colleague of his who was running the Oxford University corrosion unit. And we went round this, and the scientists were kind of going, scratching chins and poking it. And it was they're the ones who picked out the cracking and the risk to the vehicle. And it was a team effort to make that call. And this was a big call to take a vehicle that was running and make it a non-runner. But for me, that was the first time I'd worked professionally with my dad. And that really mattered to me. So I'm part of its story. And this was something I did with my dad, so it was part of my story. But the other thing that happened to this vehicle, the story doesn't completely stop there either, because we ran this vehicle one more time to reposition it after that event. So we moved it on the back end of a low loader, we moved it off again. And it was possibly the only time I've properly abused my position as director of the Tank Museum, because as a lifelong fan of First World War British tanks, I took a cabbie in the back of the tank. And it was the most uncomfortable, noisy, smelliest and unforgettable journey I've ever had in my life. When this thing goes over a bump, the impact goes from your toes through to your ears, and it's extraordinary, and it's an experience I'll remember for the rest of my life. And it makes us think about what an object is, because this is an object, an artefact, with significance in its own right. We all share the same significance of the vehicle and the events that were associated with it. But when you think about a museum, when you think about the experience of visiting, it's not just the physical matter of the artefact and the events around it. It's how you relate to it as an individual, what it means, in this case, to me. So the fact that I interacted with the vehicle, I became part of the vehicle story when I made that call to stop running it. And for me, that experience of working with my dad and the extraordinary experience of having a ride in a First World War tank, those are things that will stay with me for the rest of my life. And because of that, this Mark V is number one on my list of top 5 tanks today. I hope you enjoyed my next top 5 tanks. I know that some people are going to be disappointed there are only 2 First World War British tanks in there, but no, Tog could count as a First World War British tank depending on your point of view. So, and we've got more as well, so if I do another one, then there's more First World War British tanks we can pick from, so just to make you feel better. If you did enjoy this video, please continue to support the Tank Museum. We do need your help. Subscribing to us on YouTube, supporting us on Patreon, making a purchase from our online shop. These are all ways you can help us do the work we do and continue to bring this subject alive for the future.